All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Avi Bandari. I'm associate professor in the accounting department here at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I'm the chair of Melissa's dissertation. And I want to talk a little bit about Melissa's work history, and it's quite long, right? So I had to literally write it down. So let's start, right? She has served on the US Peace Corps, where she taught accounting in Samoan Island. She also won a Peace Corps Graduate Fellowship Award. In addition, just to list a few of her many industry-related work experience, she has worked in multiple companies, which includes 2 of Fortune 500 companies. And she has worked on, Melissa had also served as the chair of the accounting department, right, in a college. And she's a certified public accountant and certified management accountant, which is 2 big accounting certifications, pretty big deal, right? And more importantly, before even her final defense, she was offered and she accepted a tenure track position in accounting at College of San Mateo in California. So congratulations, right? This is already decided. And it has been a great privilege and honor to work with Rimi and Hamid in this dissertation as well. And also thanks to Praveen, right, for your DBA leadership and for supporting DBA faculty and students as well. And speaking of Melissa's dissertation, in this dissertation, she investigates the impact of water risk disclosure on companies or firms' tendency to manage the earnings management, okay? So this is like pretty interesting research idea, very current and related to climate disclosure, but niche area. So it has a very big publication potential because it is focused on water risk disclosure area, okay? A lot has already been done in terms of climate risk disclosure, but very few in water risk disclosure. So without further ado, I would let Melissa defend her dissertation. Good luck.
All right. Thank you, Avi. I'd like to start this defense by thanking my committee members for being so supportive of my interest and helping me mold it into a researchable topic. We all hail from water-stressed regions of the world. Avi from Nepal, Rimi from Bangladesh, and Iran for Hamid, and then me from Colorado. So we possessed a shared interest in this topic, and we collaborated well on this project. The title of my dissertation is Voluntary Water Risk Disclosure and Accounting Implications, Evidence from Earnings Management. Here is our agenda for today. First, I'll discuss the motivation leading to my research questions. Then I'll outline the contributions of my study and present a brief overview of the literature. I'll describe the conceptual framework used to form my hypotheses, as well as my methodology and research results. Lastly, I'll present the conclusions that I've drawn from the results, and I've left time at the end for questions and discussion. If you want to make progress on all the major global challenges, start with water. This study addresses a research need in accounting literature and in practice. It's the issue of decreasing water security. Water insecurity is an increase in freshwater unreliability caused by both water scarcity and pollutants, such as chemicals leaching into rivers and lakes. Much of this water stress is caused by industry, or what the United Nations defines as the business population. And this industrial demand is only forecasted to increase. Yet at this time, corporations are not required to reveal their water impacts to the communities in which they operate in the United States or in any country. The goal of my research is to provide incentives for firms to voluntarily disclose proactively. The main research question for this dissertation asks, what are the effects of water risk disclosure on earnings management? And additionally, what are the impacts of top management commitment, corporate governance, and external assurance on that association between water risk disclosure and earnings management? Contributions. This study provides an additional application of information, voluntary disclosure, and signaling theories by considering the water disclosure behaviors of corporations. It also extends the accounting literature, which has primarily focused on corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance disclosures. Although more recently, carbon risk disclosures have been studied. This study adds to the current body of knowledge in corporate water accounting by showing chief financial officers the benefits of gaining commitment from the executive team in measuring water impacts and implementing water initiatives. The study also helps to reduce the paucity of research about corporate water impacts for the United States. For my review of the literature, I'd like to define a couple terms. Corporate water accounting is an emerging branch in the accounting field. It allows companies to measure and understand the water systems in which their business and suppliers operate, as well as the volume, timing, location, and impacts of their water use. It's been found that once a firm begins measuring their impacts, then they start to make more strategic decisions about the use of that natural resource, for example, with energy consumption and carbon emissions. Part of measuring is putting an economic value on water. Currently, water is often valued at cost or below cost. Deloitte encourages companies to use the market value of water when presenting water information, and notes that this value must be continuously updated as increasing demand and diminishing supply occurs in our society. In corporate water accounting, several tools have been developed in recent years to help companies gauge their water use and discharges and to assess their water risks. One of these tools is the calculation of a water footprint. Water footprinting is a technique that guides an organization in determining the environmental impacts of the company's products and processes on water. This allows the company to assess riskier areas, including along its supply chain. Once these risks are identified, various resources help companies implement water risk mitigation efforts with a longer-term view in mind. Corporate water reporting takes it a step further by disclosing water risks. And many corporations are beginning to report water information, whether through their CSR report or by reporting to CDP. CDP is a not-for-profit environmental data collection agency formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. It launched its water disclosure project in 2009, so therefore 13 years of data are now available. In 2014, PricewaterhouseCoopers partnered with CDP and several other organizations to develop guidelines for a common approach to water disclosure. They define corporate water reporting as the act of reporting to stakeholders information related to the current state of a company's water management, the implications of that state for the business and its stakeholders, and how the company develops and implements strategic responses. Thus, a best practice is not only to have corporate water accounting system in place to measure impacts, but then also to report out on those impacts. My hypotheses are grounded in research on several theories and concepts. First, information theory suggests that information asymmetry is inherent in the capital market, and managers have inside information which is not publicly available to market stakeholders. This dissertation argues that voluntary water risk disclosure reduces information asymmetry and improves the information environment. In this environment, investor monitoring is increased, and it is more difficult for management to manipulate earnings undetected. The accounting literature documents that management's choice to voluntarily disclose non-financial information improves multiple performance measures. This information complements the financial information. For example, in demonstrating how a water initiative decreased an expense item year over year, stakeholders would have a complete view into how that expense item decreased. However, disclosing such information may impose costs to the firm. For example, in disclosing proprietary information. Yet, voluntary disclosure theory suggests that management will discretionarily choose to disclose information above the requirements of generally accepted accounting principles or the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, if the costs of doing so are not too high. The reason is twofold. First, if management does not disclose, adverse selection can occur, whereby investors and other stakeholders believe management to be withholding information and they assume it to be bad news. Second, this voluntary disclosure sends a signal that the company is a quality performer and it can bear any cost associated with increased disclosure. Signaling theory suggests that better performing firms publicize signals envied by less quality firms. Better performing firms are more willing to disclose information about company environmental initiatives, such as water initiatives. And the literature shows that such firms are less likely to manage earnings. Lastly, ethical considerations play a part in why firms disclose water risk. Firms that disclose are more likely to foster an ethical climate. Corporate ethical culture hypothesis suggests that by their nature, some companies devote more resources to doing good. Kim et al. 2012 assert that the expenditure of resources and efforts signals that the company does care about its environmental initiatives, such as water impacts and initiatives related to that. And these companies are more likely to promote honesty within the organization and are less likely to manage earnings. Hypothesis 1 is segmented into two elements. First, H1A predicts that firms that choose to disclose water risk experience less earnings management than firms that choose not to disclose. This was an analysis of firms that responded to CDP's request for water information, and they made their answers public, versus firms that did not respond to CDP's request, or they responded, but they did not make their answers public. The second element, H1B, extent of disclosure, predicted that firms with higher levels of water risk disclosure experience less earnings management than firms with lower levels of water risk disclosure. So firms that did choose to disclose to CDP and made their answers public were analyzed based on their quantity of disclosure. Hypothesis 2 relates to quality of the disclosures to CDP. I posited that quality of water risk disclosure has a negative association with earnings management. Earnings management occurs when a company's management team manipulates revenues and expenses for some goal, usually to increase reported net income. Some transactions have a discretionary component that involves management judgment, such as useful lives of assets in calculating depreciation. The construct of earnings management reflects the propensity of managers of a firm to discretionarily change components of a transaction. Higher quality information increases transparency and reduces the information asymmetric gap between the management and the stakeholders, because the information overall is richer and more complete. Opportunities for management to manipulate earnings are decreased, since it would be difficult for them to hide their manipulations in an environment with such a rich quality of information. In addition to the conceptual framework underlying this study that I just reviewed for H1 and H2, hypotheses 3, 4, and 5 draw on literature specific to each construct. Hypothesis 3 relates to top management commitment and draws on upper echelon theory from the strategic management literature. Upper echelon theory suggests that the top management team members bring to their positions certain values, backgrounds, and experiences that influence the strategic choices the team makes. In the accounting literature, the tone at the top hypothesis suggests that the top management team sets the organizational culture, most often with regard to ethics, but this could also apply to concern for the environment and concern for water security. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners states that this tone at the top trickles down to the rest of the organization. If the top management team is committed to a certain initiative, such as water stewardship or water disclosure, then the company executives are sending a message that they are willing to be held to a higher level of accountability. That message will be conveyed, and the whole company will be aware of this value and act accordingly. Thus, with hypothesis 3, I posited that the negative association between quality of water risk disclosure and earnings management is more pronounced in firms with higher degrees of top management commitment. Hypothesis 4 analyzes the differences in the impact of water risk disclosure quality on earnings management for firms with strong versus weak corporate governance mechanisms. The corporate governance literature studies the effects of certain monitoring mechanisms related to the oversight of the board of directors. Since 2002, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act has resulted in more stringent applications of both internal and external corporate governance mechanisms for publicly traded firms. Multiple studies in the corporate governance literature have tested these mechanisms and found that a stronger board of directors leads to better corporate outcomes such as firm value, cost of equity capital, and credit ratings. H4 also relies on agency theory and argues that the monitoring power of the board can attenuate management's self-interest and mitigate opportunistic behaviors of the agents or the managers, resulting in decreased earnings manipulations to the benefit of the owners or the principals. Taking these arguments together, I predicted that the negative association between quality of water risk disclosure and earnings management is more pronounced in firms with stronger corporate governance than in firms with weaker corporate governance. My last hypothesis relates to assurance. External assurance occurs when an accounting firm or consulting agency verifies the information presented by a company, usually financial information. In the case of this study, it is voluntary water information that is assured. The literature has found that having voluntary disclosures verified by an independent third party increases the credibility of the information presented. This concept ties into legitimacy theory, which suggests that firms seek to enhance the credibility of their reported information in line with their social contract that they have with society. Rizé and Tuo, 2019, find a positive relationship between the assurance of voluntary disclosures and earnings quality. Therefore, for hypothesis 5, I posited that the negative association between quality of water risk disclosure and earnings management is more pronounced in firms with external assurance of their water disclosure data. This image summarizes the conceptual model and the 5 hypotheses I developed. The left-hand side presents quantity of disclosure as 2 elements, choice to disclose and extent of disclosure. Also on the left, quality of disclosure is represented. Both quantity and quality are predicted to have a negative association with earnings management. In addition, I bring in 3 moderating influences that are predicted to magnify this negative association: the degree of top management commitment, the strength of corporate governance, and the procurement of external assurance. The dependent variable of interest, earnings management, was proxied by a model developed by Dichal and Dichev in 2002 and modified by McNichols also in 2002. And I conducted a robustness test using the Jones model from 1991. The independent variables are quantity and quality of disclosure, and the variables for moderation analysis are top management commitment, corporate governance, and external assurance. For data collection, I utilized CDP's water security survey data sets from 2010 to 2022. Prior research has used the CDP data sets predominantly in carbon emission studies. Just a note that CDP represents investor members and signatories from around the world that request certain companies be solicited to respond to the CDP surveys on water security as well as carbon emissions risk and forest risk. For 2022, about 680 investor groups representing approximately 130 trillion US dollars in assets under management requested companies to disclose their water risks. That amount has grown significantly since 2009. The panel data was unbalanced because not all firms in the data sets answered the survey questions for all years. Also, some of the firms were acquired or went bankrupt during the time period under review. Other data sources were CompuStat and CRISP for financial variables, and I used GV keys to merge the firms with the CompuStat and CRISP data. Earnings management, as I mentioned earlier, is a representation of management's changes to revenues and expenses through accrual journal entries, most often to boost reported income. I operationalized earnings management using the DCHOW and DCHEV model as modified by McNichols, which is frequently used in the literature as a measure of accruals quality. The model proxies how well accruals map into cash flows in the current period and the adjacent preceding and subsequent periods. The formula is presented here. Step 1 calculates the difference between the working capital accruals and the fitted values, where CA represents the change in working capital accruals, CFO is the cash flow from operations for the multiple time periods, delta revenue is the change in revenues, and PPE represents property, plant, and equipment to allow for depreciation. Then in step 2, earnings management was calculated as the standard deviation of the residuals, or the error terms, for the past 5 years. Quantity was operationalized in 2 ways. First, choice to disclose related to all firms that were requested to respond to CDP's water security survey. The firms were given a 1 if they responded and they made their answers public, but they were given a 0 if they did not respond or they responded and did not make their answers public. Second, extent of disclosure was operationalized by a count of the number of questions that each disclosing firm answered of the total possible questions. I calculated the proportion of questions each firm answered in the CDP datasets for each year. Then I took the natural log of this number as an additional measure of quantity. To measure quality of disclosure, this study utilized an already existing index created by Clarkson et al., which was originally used to measure quality of voluntary environmental disclosures. This is just a snapshot. There are a total of 45 items. For my study's purpose, I modified this index to a water context. On the left-hand side, you can see the original index relating to environmental disclosures. Each index item maps to the Global Reporting Initiative, which is the most widely used sustainability reporting system in the world. For example, I've circled adoption of GRI sustainability reporting guidelines or provision of a Sears report on the left, and on the right-hand side, I modified it to a water perspective, adoption of water reporting guidelines. For my study, I used the water-modified quality index items that are listed here. I scored firms for each of these index items using content analysis of their responses to the CDP water security questionnaires. Examples of when a firm would earn a point if they disclosed, participation in voluntary water initiatives endorsed by the EPA or the United Nations, and amount spent on fines related to water issues, and a statement about specific water innovations and new technologies. A higher score indicated higher quality disclosure, recognizing that higher quality water risk disclosure provides more substantive and meaningful information for users. I used multiple methods to capture the CDP metrics. I analyzed all of the content from the CDP water security datasets for US companies from 2010 to 2022. I manually coded many of the responses. Then I also coded responses using natural language processing. Fortunately for me, my husband is a Python programmer, and he wrote programs based on my instructions using the entity recognition software called Spacey. He utilized 13 subdictionaries that I created for this study. I used gray literature related to water security, for example, from the United Nations or the International Federation of Accountants. I also used white papers published by Deloitte and Ernst & Young and others related to water disclosures. Only concrete items were awarded points. Concrete in this case means that the item was quantifiable or it related to a past occurrence. In other words, no abstract items like forecasted amounts or forward-looking statements were awarded points. This is an example of a coding technique I used. Here, entity recognition was performed on all datasets, all fields, all years, and points were assigned automatically if the term or terms occurred. This example is for the quality index item 1.5, related to whether a company uses some form of a water assessment tool to assess its water risks. This list represents tools such as the WRI Aqueduct and the Ecolab Water Risk Monetizer that are actively being utilized around the world today. For the second technique, the software matched assigned values for selected questions if the specific term was present. I had identified the question in advance, and I would instruct as to what the answer must be in order for a firm to receive a point automatically. This example relates to quality index item 2.9 with respect to trade associations. If a firm selected, the specific term appears as one of the options for this CDP question. And if a firm selected it, yes, trade associations, in response to the question, they were awarded a point. But they might have the term in a comment field next to the question. And so if they mentioned it in that comment field, they were awarded a point as well. The logic was that the firm disclosed that they were involved in a trade organization and they deserved a point. With the third technique, entity recognition software conducted a search and point values were assigned automatically based on a specific phrase in an answer. Here's an example for quality index item 3.8 for firms disclosing whether they have an environmental performance indicator or EPIs related to watersheds. If a firm selected one of these targets, they received a point automatically. Therefore, just a note, I did double check these to make sure that they were all awarded correctly. For the fourth technique, if a firm was matched by the entity recognition software, the observation was then sent to me via a web application and I manually awarded a 1 or a 0 upon review. For example, these terms listed here related to two index items, 2.6 and 7.3 regarding awards. Some of these terms, as you can see, are quite broad, and I wanted to manually review each observation. Plus, there were two index items related to awards, internal awards and external awards. Therefore, I manually reviewed all the observations to assign points as appropriate. To operationalize top management commitment, I used the following questions from the CDP water security datasets. Does your organization have a water policy? And further, is it publicly available? Or is it company-wide? Note that a firm could choose if their water policy was just for specific sites only. To operationalize corporate governance, I used the question asking if there was board-level oversight over water-related issues in the organization and the frequency of reports to the board. I also awarded points for these water governance mechanisms here in pink that a firm could select if these mechanisms occurred within their own board of directors. Note that number 10 was not used. I identified it as potential greenwashing and excluded it. Lastly, to operationalize assurance, I used this question which asks if the company is having its water withdrawals data independently verified. Ordinary least squares regression was used in this study. This first equation represents quantity with the control variables added, which I'll define in a couple slides. Consistent with prior literature, I also included industry and year fixed effects in the model. A negative coefficient was expected on beta 1, which would suggest that firms with a higher quantity of water risk disclosure would experience less earnings management. Model 2 relates to quality. The same controls were used, as well as industry and year fixed effects. Again, a negative coefficient was expected on the coefficient for beta 1, suggesting that higher quality is associated with less earnings management. Here are the definitions of the control variables. Controls were selected based on those that are commonly used for earnings management studies. I included firm size to control for variation in financial reporting quality based on firm size. Firm profitability is a potential determinant of generally accepted accounting principle violations, as poor performance puts pressure on a company to engage in aggressive financial reporting behavior. Therefore, I included a loss indicator variable and return on assets. I also controlled for whether a firm was in a litigious industry. To control for firm complexity, I included the existence of foreign operations and the square root of the number of business segments that a firm operated within. I further included market-to-book ratio to control for firm growth opportunities, and I included firm age, which is a standard control in accounting literature. Let's see here. Leverage, which puts additional pressure on a firm as the violation of debt covenants has serious consequences, was also included. Sales growth was used to control for the firm's growth opportunities. I controlled for the standard deviation of earnings per share over the past 5 years, which is a proxy for firm risk. I also controlled for the corporate governance proxy of whether a firm uses a Big Four auditor or not. Lastly, I controlled for mergers and acquisitions, as this factor may provide managers incentive, to engage in aggressive financial reporting behaviors. The sample included U.S. public firms that were requested by CDP to respond to the annual CDP Water Security Survey for the years 2010 to 2022. The initial sample consisted of 4,395 firm year observations. The final sample consisted of 1,926 disclosing firms after merging with CompuStat and CRISP. Then, those disclosing firms were matched with 1,960 firms that did not respond to CDP's request or did not make their answers public. Descriptive statistics are provided for all variables in the study. To mitigate any effects of outliers, all the continuous variables were Windsorized at the 1 and 99 percentiles. The descriptive statistics here are generally consistent with prior research. Hypothesis 1A regarding choice to disclose was supported. I used the difference in means test to compare non-disclosing firms versus disclosing firms, and the mean of earnings management for the disclosing firms was less than the means of earnings management for the non-disclosing firms. This indicates less earnings management in the disclosing firms. Hypothesis 1B addressed the extent of disclosure. Ordinary least squares regression was conducted using the primary measure. Okay, thank you. Okay. Ordinary least squares regression was conducted using the primary measure for earnings management, the DCHOW and DCHEV model as modified by Nichols in 2002. The quantity of water risk disclosure was negatively associated with earnings management, supporting H1B's prediction. The table shows that the beta coefficient is negative and significant at a p-value of less than 0.05 for both quant2 and ln quant2. To establish robustness of my results, I performed a battery of additional tests for all of my hypotheses. For H1B, to examine the robustness of the results, I replicated the analysis using the alternate measure for earnings management, the Jones 1991 model, which you can see here on the right. This model uses the deviations of actual accruals from non-discretionary accruals in order to calculate discretionary accruals, which is a proxy for earnings management. My results held, and the beta coefficients were negative and significant at a p-value of less than 0.05, as shown in this partial representation of the regression table. Another robustness check that I conducted on H1B was entropy balancing. Through entropy balancing, observations receive weights on a continuous spectrum. In the context of this research, entropy balancing was conducted using the median values of quant2. And again, my findings held. The beta coefficients are negative and significant on quant2 and ln of quant2. Ordinary least squares regression, It was used on this hypothesis, though. Hypothesis 2, which related to the quality of the disclosure, was also supported. Each of these scenarios presents a combination of industry and year fixed effects. Controls were implemented for all scenarios. The beta coefficient was negative and significant on qual 1 for each of these combinations, showing that water disclosure quality is negatively associated with earnings management. Entropy balancing confirmed the main results for H2. The beta coefficients were negative and significant on all combinations, lending robustness to the main findings. This robustness test for H2 used multiple alternate measures for quality, qual 2, qual 3, and qual 4, which were all based on the quality index I had created. And the results are consistent with the main findings. The results for H2 continue to hold with entropy balancing, with an entropy balanced sample using the alternate measures for quality. Cross-sectional analysis was conducted for hypothesis 3. Disclosing firms were split along the medium into two subsamples, those with high top management commitment and those with low top management commitment. This approach of partitioning a sample based on median split and subsequently conducting moderation analysis is a well-established practice within the existing literature, and I've cited some here. The primary measure for top management commitment was whether a company had a water policy and if it was publicly available. The beta coefficient is negative and significant at the 10% level for the high top management commitment group, supporting H3. This indicates that the effect of disclosure quality on earnings management is stronger in the presence of higher degrees of top management commitment. The first robustness check for H3 employed an entropy balance sample using the primary measure for top management commitment and further substantiated the main findings. The beta coefficient for the high top management commitment group is negative and significant at a p-value of less than 0.05. The second robustness test for H3 utilized an alternate measure for top management commitment. This measure was a reflection of whether the company had a water policy and if it was company-wide. The beta coefficient was again negative and significant, supporting the robustness of my main findings. The results of hypothesis 4 provided support for my prediction regarding stronger corporate governance. Again, the sample was segmented into two groups, those disclosing firms above the median, or the strong group, and those below the median, or the weak group. The corporate governance measure was a reflection of if the company had board-level oversight on water-related issues. For the strong group, the beta coefficient was negative and significant at the 5% level, showing that the effect of quality on earnings management is stronger in the presence of strong corporate governance. Entropy balancing was employed to test the robustness of my main findings for H4, and the findings held. The beta coefficient was negative, and it was significant at a p-value of less than 0.1. An alternate measure for corporate governance yielded the same results in robustness test 2. It was a reflection of which of the water governance mechanisms were incorporated into the board of directors' functions at the firm, and the results held. And I used an additional alternate measure for corporate governance in robustness test 3, which with the main results holding, and this measure reflected how frequently the board was reported to on water-related issues. Hypothesis 5 related to assurance. The table demonstrates that disclosing firms were partitioned into two groups, firms with assurance and firms without assurance of their water data. The beta coefficients are negative and significant for both groups. However, the value for the assurance group is higher than the value for the no assurance group. This indicates that the reduction in magnitude of earnings management is higher in firms with assurance of their water data. This means that when assurance is present, the effect is stronger on the negative association between disclosure quality and earnings management. A note that a z-test was conducted between the coefficients, and it found that the difference between the coefficients on qual 1 was statistically significant at the 10% level. A robustness test was conducted using alternate measures for quality, qual 2, qual 3, and qual 4 that I mentioned earlier, which were measured using the Water Modified Quality Index, and the table demonstrates similar results to my main findings. Conclusions. This study suggests that firms that engage in more transparent water disclosure tend to be less inclined to manipulate their earnings, thus supporting the proposition that water risk disclosure is positively associated with financial reporting quality. It also shows that water risk disclosure matters more in firms with higher degrees of commitment from the top management team to water stewardship, stronger corporate water governance on the board, and external assurance of water data. Implications. My dissertation offers support for policymakers who might prefer that corporations disclose their water impacts as a standard practice. In thinking about water-stressed regions of the United States and the impacts of corporations operating within those regions, over time, the need for mandatory disclosure from these corporations might become undeniable, especially as we go forward and water becomes an even more stressed resource. And as water risk increases, the findings of the study become even more relevant to users of corporate risk information, like auditors and investors in their decision-making, and auditors as they plan their client engagements. The study contributes a comprehensive measure of water risk disclosure quality as disclosures of this type become a more mainstream praxis and research in this area grows. Lastly, this research boosts arguments for corporations to begin voluntarily disclosing their water impacts if they are not already doing so. Limitations. Endogeneity occurs when an explanatory variable is correlated with the error term, which may produce biased and inconsistent coefficient estimates. In my study, there are two plausible causes for endogeneity. The variables of interest, water disclosure, quantity and quality, and earnings management could be jointly determined by some unobservable construct, or there could be an omitted variable that affects both water disclosure, quantity and quality, and earnings management. Numerous control variables were included in the models, as well as industry and year fixed effects to address this concern. Entropy balancing was employed in order to address potential self-selection bias. This technique optimized the weighting of match treatment observations. To address potential measurement error, multiple alternative measures were used to test my hypotheses in a variety of ways. In addition, there are limitations related to the CDP survey. The water risk disclosure metrics employed in this research study are based on the information gathered through CDP. Therefore, the effectiveness of these water risk disclosure metrics hinges on the specific inquiries posed by CDP in their questionnaires. Lastly, since the study was conducted only in the United States for US firms, the results may not be generalizable. The United States level of awareness about water scarcity and water pollutants may differ from those of other countries. Future studies could employ the Water Disclosure Quality Index I created to analyze CSR reports or 10K filings. The subdictionaries could also be used in future content analysis research in water disclosures. A longitudinal or event study involving water disclosure could be conducted on various corporate outcomes, or a similar methodology could be used to capture corporate forest risk. Thank you.
Great presentation, Melissa. Very impressive.
Thank you.
So I have written down quite a few questions for you. Okay, let's start with theory. In your dissertation, you have used plenty of theories, right? For ethical consideration, we have ethical theory for top management commitment. There is a tone at the top theory. For corporate governance, we have corporate governance literature. But when it comes about information asymmetry, you have listed three different theories: information theories, voluntary disclosure theory, and signaling theory. Okay, and let's say you have to pick one because you could define information asymmetry using one theory. Okay, which would be the most important theory for you out of these three?
Out of those three, out of information theory, voluntary disclosure theory, and signaling theory,
Yeah.
I would have to say voluntary disclosure theory because the theory suggests that some firms choose to disclose more information than is actually required. And providing additional information to financial statement users only increases their ability to understand exactly what is going on with that company, whether it be financial or non-financial information. And so voluntary disclosure theory, I felt, was the strongest for this study.
Yep, I think that's a good response. Thank you so much. And let me see what I have. Yeah, I'm glad that you did entropy balancing, right? Not propensity score matching. But prior studies, they have also conducted propensity score matching to address self-selection bias. So what is the reason like you sticking with entropy balancing, not propensity score matching?
Okay, yeah, we considered that for this study. But recent research has demonstrated that entropy balancing is more effective than propensity score matching. And I have cited those studies in my dissertation because it retains the original sample size. And with the propensity score matching, you lose observations and the sample size reduces. So that's why it was better in this case to use.
Yeah, I think that's true because entropy balancing actually preserves your original sample size.
Yeah.
And can you talk about your adjusted R square? Is it like consistent with prior research? Is it too low?
No, the adjusted R square came out well. It was robust. It was between 40 to 50%, which is in line with prior research. So yeah, it was fine.
It was fine. Let's see. So let's talk about your governance mechanisms, right? I know you use governance mechanism for your H4, right? So can you give me one or two examples of what could be certain governance mechanisms be, especially in terms of water disclosure?
Okay, yeah. So if you think about the board of directors and their role in general, and then thinking about it in terms of water, would be reviewing capital expenditures related to water capital expenditures, and or reviewing strategy with the top management team to see where the company's heading in terms of based off of how risky their industry is, water risk, and also plans of action going forward, or how they would respond to droughts, floods, hurricanes, depending on where their locations are. So reviewing those types of things with the top management team, making sure they had a plan in place.
Okay, yeah, good job. And let me see whether I have any questions left. Yep. So you have used OLS regression in most of your regression analysis, but in order to support H1A, you have used mean difference test. Can you clarify why you are using mean difference test in H1A?
Oh, yeah. It's because the number of disclosing firms, there was 1,926 that were disclosing, but 1,960 were non-disclosing. So we had to use that, as you know, Avi, because you were with me. But we had to use that because if we try to use regression, we would have lost some of those non-disclosing firms. So it made more sense to use the difference in means for that case.
Yeah, because you would lose those observations mostly because they don't have some of the control variable information, right? Like if you
exactly. They would be eliminated.
All right.
We didn't want that to happen. So.
Thank you so much for answering my questions, Rimi.
Thank you, Abhi. Yes. Got it. So wonderful presentation, Melissa. Very clear, organized.
Thank you.
And then in terms of your dissertation, I was very impressed with it in terms of your, the way you logically, with a lot of heading, subheading. You created all that, incorporated the literature, and then developed the hypothesis. So I enjoyed reading your dissertation. And then the results are very robust. I think empirically, what she did is fantastic. So that's wonderful. I would ask a few questions that once you maybe send it to journals for reviews, these questions might come back, and you might have to deal with it. So not to give you a hard time, but really to start to think about it.
Yeah.
Is that you basically code the responses, and these are subjective level coding. The way you're assigning points, the questions you're choosing, some of the questions you're not choosing to create your construct.
Well, I based the questions that I chose. It was all hinged on, was primarily hinged on the quality index that already existed. So that drove some of the choices.
Yeah, absolutely. But my point was that if it's not built on a particular scholarly work, prior work, it's hard to position it scholarly. So how would you, do you have plans to do that? How would you do that? How would you say, from the scholarly perspective, what contribution then you make? I see that, empirically, you find correlations. All of that is wonderful, very inspiring, actually. But then scholarly perspective, if it has to go to a very, and I think it has the potential to go to a very good journal, then how would you position it in that manner? What's your plan?
I mean, I think it actually builds on the carbon emissions research, the disclosure area. So it's just that it's, as Avi mentioned at the beginning, it's a niche area. So I think it would be attractive, actually, to journals. And I have cited studies that I followed when they were measuring, quality of carbon risk disclosure or something like that. So it builds on the conversation. Am I answering your question correctly?
You are.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fantastic. All I'm saying is that as you move forward this line of work, I think it might be helpful to bring in other disclosure type literature.
Okay.
And how they approached, coding and.
Okay. Yes, I did meet with. Yeah,
Basically
I should mention this.
tying it to, yeah, right.
I met with Aaron McKinney. He was kind enough to meet with me. He's a subject matter expert in content analysis.
I think that's something you should also mention in your, because that does happen, that if you consulted with an expert, throughout this process.
Yes, he gave me an excellent idea.
Right. So
And so he said that journals often want to see, if you had an automatic one and then you do it by hand, like maybe just 100 observations, and see how closely they matched.
Okay.
And so I would need to do before I would submit it to a journal.
Right.
Yes.
And I think I would just say, yeah, there are ways to kind of do it, but then as long as you preemptively explain that process in your manuscript, it's received better than.
Right, I understand.
Going there.
Okay.
That's the recommendation.
Yes, yes.
Other thing is that I see that you, just like Avi said, that you have lots of theories, right? So my recommendation would be, as you move forward with publishing and that, think, as he was saying, think of one theory that you're really contributing to. So in the case of hypothesis 1, it would be the voluntary disclosure theory. The rest of it, you can bring it in your theoretical implication section.
Okay.
Because it relates to your theories, but you're not contributing to that theory.
Okay.
You're not adding to that.
Right, I see.
So I think there are ways to and then, as if you remember, your hypotheses were very long, and I appreciated reading it. It was so thorough, in that way, very informative, but that's one way you can probably, position your papers.
Mhm.
Last thing I would ask is me being in management and strategy. My question would be if if I'm thinking from the perspective of a company managing and doing well,
Mhm.
right? And from the strategy perspective, we care a lot about how the company is doing financially, right? So my question is why should I care so much about earnings management?
Oh, okay.
And again, it's not a criticism. It's just a way of thinking. And
Mhm.
really, if managers are going to learn something from your research, how would they be motivated to be like, okay, this really translates into some results that in the end the stakeholders care about,
That's what it is right there.
right?
You just
So
nailed it on the head. Especially as the younger generations come up behind us, they care more about this stuff. They care how corporations are behaving. And so the management teams, like that's why I mentioned like having a longer term view on things instead of just having this quarterly, focus, which we've heard that so many times that they need to think beyond just the quarter. But if their company is, it could be perceived as unethical and younger generations, they don't want to support corporations like that anymore. And it's becoming more and more like that. We're seeing it in the younger generation. So as we move forward, this type of information, we could go through and like list each of these firms that we looked at and say, So, it is information that's important to the firms, how they're perceived by investors and customers.
yeah, so it probably has reputational
Yes,
as well.
absolutely. Reputational implications.
So thank you again for a wonderful, dissertation. It's
Thank you.
theoretically important, intriguing, and practically quite relevant.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate it.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Hamid.
I have a couple of questions. Can you go to the survey that shows the line items in the survey,
Oh, the index?
the index? Yeah. This one.
This one?
Yeah. So this is where you start your measure, right?
For quality, yeah.
And can you explain how it ties to your measure?
I'm sorry?
Can you just elaborate how these lines would add to your quality measure?
Sure, yeah. So I came across the Clarkson et al. Index in my readings, my literature review. And I really appreciated how that index is so, it's like impartial. It's very like neutral. It's not leaning towards one way or the other, whatever. And so I started thinking about it in terms of water items. And then I converted the entire thing to a water context.
Okay.
And then I wanted to do all 45 items, but I started realizing that not all 45 items were addressed in the CDP data sets. So I narrowed it down to the 16 that I could find answers in the CDP data sets to give points or not give points.
And then you created those dictionaries and looked up those words in the context to see if some of them appear or not, right?
Well, what I did was I started broader. I started with an accounting study. And theirs was environmental, so there was only a handful of terms that were related to water. But I started there, and then I built on those terms that already existed that they had.
Okay.
And so I didn't make them. I just made them more broad.
So you took the dictionary and expanded them. Okay.
Yes.
So I think part of the comments that Remy made is about the dictionaries. If you build, you would basically need to think about the robustness or the validity of your measure so that the measure is actually valid. And it's not skewed for some of the firms as opposed to the others. Your measure is not overweighting any of the aspects in this in a form that would discriminate against some of the companies or the other. So I'm sure you can figure this out. There are so many different techniques that are possible to be in the NLP world that you can perform to actually validate your measure, but definitely that would be certainly necessary before you can send this anywhere. And then did you have to do any standardization for your quality measure? Did you make it a standard between 0 and 1 or 0 and 10? Did you
Oh, I'm
think
sorry.
about the
I didn't hear you.
standardizing it?
I didn't hear what you said. I'm sorry.
The quality measure? Did you
the
think
quality
about the standardizing it?
Standardizing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought you said sanitizing. I'm like, standardize it. I mean, all the firms had the equal opportunity to get points on all the 16 items. It just related to how much they were disclosing in their comments or.
But some of them have higher weights if you followed the same.
Oh, no, okay,
You didn't
thank
follow
you.
the same.
Yeah.
You didn't.
So for the ones that, the EPIs, the environmental performance indicators, they could earn up to 6 points. And so I use for those, I use the questions related to targets and goals. CDP asks them, do you have any targets and goals related to water security? And so I could give them as many points as I could, up to 6.
Up to 6.
Yeah. And there were some, and again, I considered it greenwashing. There were a couple firms that had just all the more than 6, but at a certain point they were sort of repeating the same thing over and over. So it was good to have that sort of top ceiling factor in place because it could have been
I think what I'm
greenwashing.
getting at is that imagine a firm that doesn't have any, so scores 0 in all of the other ones, but scores 6 in the 4 EPI measures. Then they would be heavily weighted high in the overall quality index.
They all get asked if they have targets and goals, and they're allowed to put as many as they want to list.
So is there any reason that I would be concerned as to why did they not, basically they didn't do anything else, but the EPI performance was high. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I did follow that from Clarkson et al. That was their methodology. They had 0 to 6.
But is there any other reason?
So I could look at if
Yeah.
we're too high, but
So I think one way to look at this is that you can actually look at each of these components if you have if you collected the measures and kept them separate for each of these sections. I would think that a robustness test, which I don't know how it would actually tie into the incentives of the management, whether there's any differences among how the firm scores in each of these categories and the earnings management outcome, and whether any of these would actually be individually be an indicator of the disclosure incentives of the
I see what
company.
you're saying. Yeah, that's a good idea.
So that was one of my ideas. And can you go to robustness test for hypothesis 3 in the tables? Or any of them actually would work. So you mentioned like here, you have, for some of these, I don't know which one was it, but I think one of them was also H3, that you split your sample based on the median.
Yes, we used the partitioning of the samples.
So am I understanding this correct, that if you chose median, then your sample size was, your sample would have been cut in half?
Well, I mean, you can see the number of observations of the firms that fell above the median.
But my confusion is that if you cut your sample on the median, then the number of observations should be similar for both of the categories.
No, I mean, there were ones that fell above the median and the ones that were below the median.
But median is the middle one. Mm-hmm. So 50% of them would be lower.
I can't really hear you. I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
Same with the CSI score.
I know. I know, yes, but I was expecting Melissa to actually answer that, but yeah.
I apologize. I cannot
I'm
hear
sorry.
you, Hamid. I
I'm
cannot
sorry if
hear
I'm
what you're saying.
speaking too slow.
No, it's like.
Oh, is it? Is it better now? Is it better now?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Abby.
But yeah, no. So it retained all the disclosing firms, okay? It's a reflection of if they were above or below, that's how we partitioned it.
Yeah, no, I get it, but so the expectation, I mean, which Abby is explaining, is that your number of observations would be similar for when you're using the 50th percentile. You would expect that half of your population would be falling below the median and half would be above the median. And then when you have such a wide difference between the number of observation in each group, it's suggesting that so many of them are actually the median.
Right, yeah, that could be the case.
So-
Because in this case, the question for the alternate measure was if they had a water policy and if it was company-wide. So 1 or 0, in a lot of cases. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome, thank you.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm sorry, Hamid, I couldn't hear very well.
Thank you for a very informative presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Just one quick question. I had difficulty with one regression. I noticed that you had done 2. What was the intent behind that?
Well, actually, the cross-sectional analysis, this is OLS regression. It is ordinary least squares as well. So, but we did the difference in means test for the first hypothesis because it was choice to disclose or not, and so the difference in means test made more sense because we would have lost from our sample size if we tried to use a regression, because the control variables would have eliminated more firms. So that's why we did the difference in means test.
Okay, and pun completely intended, but if the floodgates were to open, what additional research do you think you might do with it?
Ooh, if the floodgates opened? Oh gosh, very punny. I'm not going to give away my secret of what I want to do next. No, I'm really interested in taking this index, which I'm going to work with Hamid on this and getting it, validated. Does that work for you, Hamid? The quality index? And then I'd like to use it on other documents like CSR reports. And a lot of times they put their CSR reports on websites. So websites or 10K filings. And then use other corporate outcomes, like you mentioned, Remy, firm value or various things. Yes, there's so many directions this could go. It's really exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Praveen.